The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Gulch, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and gold. The town was already stirring to life, but there was something different about this particular Tuesday that made the air feel heavy with anticipation and shame. Word had spread quickly through the small frontier settlement about what would happen at noon, and despite the early hour, curious faces were already peering from behind curtains and over swinging doors. At the center of it all stood the market post, a thick wooden beam that had served the community for countless transactions and announcements. Today, however, it would serve a crueler purpose. The town council had made their decision the night before, and Sheriff Morrison had reluctantly agreed to carry it out. The sins of the father would be visited upon the daughter, as was the harsh way of frontier justice when debts went unpaid and shame needed to be publicly acknowledged. Margaret O'Sullivan sat in the cramped jail cell, her small hands folded in her lap, trying to appear braver than her 16 years should require. Her dark hair hung in loose waves around her shoulders, and her blue eyes held a mixture of fear and resignation that would have broken stronger hearts than those found in Cedar Gulch. She wore a simple brown dress, patched in several places but clean, a testament to her efforts to maintain dignity despite her father's failings. Patrick O'Sullivan had been the town's most notorious drunk for the better part of 3 years. Once a proud Irish immigrant with dreams of prosperity in the American frontier, he had succumbed to the bottle after his wife died of fever, leaving him to raise Margaret alone. His descent had been swift and merciless. Gambling debts mounted, promises were broken, and trust was shattered like glass on saloon floors. When he finally disappeared one moonless night, taking the last of the money he had borrowed from half the merchants in town, he left behind only his daughter and a legacy of shame that the community was determined to see answered for. The law in Cedar Gulch was simple and unforgiving. When a debtor fled, family members were held responsible for the shame brought upon the community. Margaret would be tied to the post from noon until sunset, a living reminder of her father's cowardice and a warning to others who might consider similar betrayals. It was an old tradition, brought from the harsh realities of communities that had to enforce their own justice, and while some questioned its fairness, none dared speak against it openly. Sheriff Morrison unlocked the cell door with hands that trembled slightly. He had known Margaret since she was a child, had watched her grow up trying to care for her increasingly unstable father while maintaining her own quiet dignity. The irony wasn't lost on him that she was probably the most honest person in town, yet she would bear the punishment for another's dishonesty. "It's time, Margaret," he said softly, his voice heavy with regret. She stood without complaint, smoothing her dress and lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance that reminded him painfully of her mother. "I understand, Sheriff Morrison. I'm ready." The walk from the jail to the market post felt like a funeral procession. Word had spread, and people lined the street, some with sympathy in their eyes, others with the hard satisfaction of seeing justice served, no matter how misplaced. Children peered around their mothers' skirts, not fully understanding what they were witnessing but sensing its gravity. The preacher stood on the church steps, his face a mask of conflicted duty, knowing he should speak for mercy but bound by the community's decision. Margaret walked with her head held high, refusing to give the town the satisfaction of seeing her break. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust that seemed to hang in the still air like accusations. She could hear whispers following her, fragments of conversations that spoke of shame and justice, of lessons to be learned and examples to be set. But she also heard, beneath the murmurs of judgment, voices of those who knew her true character, who understood that she was paying for sins that were never her own. At the post, Sheriff Morrison's hands shook as he bound her wrists with rope that was rougher than necessary, but not tight enough to cause real harm. This was about shame, not torture, though the distinction felt meaningless in the blazing heat of the noon sun. Margaret closed her eyes as the rope was secured, offering a silent prayer not for rescue, but for the strength to endure this trial with the dignity her mother would have wanted her to show. "I'm sorry, child," the sheriff whispered so quietly that only she could hear. "This isn't right, and we both know it." "It's not your fault," she replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. "You're just doing what the town expects. I understand." The crowd began to disperse once the spectacle was established, people returning to their daily routines but glancing back periodically to check on the scene. Some brought their children closer, using Margaret as a lesson about the consequences of irresponsibility and the importance of family honor. Others hurried past, uncomfortable with the display but unwilling to challenge it. Miles away, on a ranch that bordered the edge of Cedar Gulch's influence, Jacob Thornton was mending fence when his foreman, Carlos, rode up with news from town. Jacob was a man carved by the harsh realities of frontier life, tall and weathered, with hands that spoke of honest work and eyes that had seen both beauty and brutality in equal measure. At 32, he had been running his ranch alone for 8 years, ever since his father died and left him to manage both the land and the isolation that came with it. Carlos spoke in rapid Spanish, his agitation clear even before Jacob understood the words. When the story became clear, something cold and hard settled in Jacob's chest. He knew Margaret O'Sullivan by reputation, had seen her in town on the rare occasions when he came in for supplies. She was known for her kindness, her hard work, and her unsuccessful efforts to keep her father on a straight path. The idea of her bound to a post for crimes she didn't commit stirred something fierce and protective in him that he hadn't felt in years. "You're sure about this, Carlos?" Jacob asked, setting down his tools and wiping his hands on his worn leather chaps. "S.E. Jeff, the whole town is talking about it. That girl, she never did nothing wrong. Her papa, he was the one who caused all the trouble, but now she pays the price. Es una injusticia." Jacob stood silent for a long moment, staring toward the town that lay beyond the rolling hills of his property. He wasn't a man given to impulsive actions, but something about this situation demanded response. He had spent years avoiding the complexities of town life, finding peace in the solitude of his ranch and the honest work of raising cattle. But sometimes, he realized, peace came at the cost of justice, and a man had to decide what he could live with. "Saddle my horse, Carlos, and prepare the wagon. Que vas a hacer, Jiff?" Jacob didn't answer immediately. He wasn't entirely sure himself, but he knew he couldn't sit on his ranch knowing that an innocent girl was suffering while her father's victims got their hollow revenge. There had to be a better way, a solution that served justice without destroying the innocent. The ride into town took him an hour, time he spent wrestling with what he planned to do and how he might accomplish it without making things worse for Margaret. Jacob Thornton wasn't a wealthy man, but he was comfortable and, more importantly, he was respected. People in Cedar Gulch knew him as honest and fair, someone who kept his word and minded his own business. That reputation, he hoped, would carry weight when he needed it most. Cedar Gulch appeared before him like a mirage wavering in the heat, and as he rode down the main street, he could see the figure tied to the post in the town square. Even from a distance, he could see that Margaret held herself with dignity, but the sight of her bound there, like a common criminal, sent anger coursing through his veins. A small crowd had gathered, some pointing and whispering, others simply staring with the morbid fascination that such spectacles always drew. Jacob dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post outside Jameson's General Store, the largest of the establishments that Patrick O'Sullivan had allegedly cheated. Harold Jameson stood on his porch, arms crossed, watching the scene with the satisfied expression of a man seeing justice served. When he noticed Jacob approaching, his expression shifted to one of curiosity and wariness. "Afternoon, Thornton. Don't usually see you in town this time of day." "Afternoon, Harold. I heard about the situation with the O'Sullivan girl. Come to see if we might find a better way to handle this." Jameson's face hardened. The way's already been decided, and rightly so. That girl's father took money from half the businesses in town, made promises he never intended to keep, and then disappeared like a thief in the night. Someone has to answer for that, and she's all that's left. She's also innocent of her father's crimes, Jacob replied evenly. "Seems to me there might be a way to address the debt without punishing someone who never committed a crime." "And what way would that be?" Jameson's voice carried the skeptical tone of a man who had heard too many excuses and believed none of them. Jacob had been considering this question during his entire ride into town, weighing his resources against the potential cost of his intervention. Patrick O'Sullivan's debts, according to Carlos's information, totaled somewhere around $200, a significant sum but not insurmountable for a man who had been carefully managing his ranch's profits for 8 years. "I'll pay the debt," Jacob said quietly. "All of it, to every merchant he cheated. In exchange, the girl goes free, and this ends today." Jameson stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "You'll what then? You barely know that girl." Why would you throw away good money on someone else's responsibilities? Because she doesn't deserve what's happening to her, and because sometimes doing the right thing costs more than we'd like to pay. $200 isn't going to break me, and it might save that girl from a lifetime of shame for something she never did. Word of Jacob's offer spread quickly through the crowd that had gathered around the post. Voices rose in surprise, speculation, and debate. Some saw it as an act of inexplicable generosity, others as the foolish gesture of a lonely man trying to buy affection. The town council members who had ordered the punishment found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having their justice complicated by mercy. Margaret had heard the commotion and raised her head to see a tall stranger in conversation with several of the town's leading citizens. She didn't recognize him, but something in his bearing suggested strength and purpose. When their eyes met across the dusty square, she saw something she hadn't expected, not pity, but anger on her behalf, and a determination that spoke of action rather than mere sympathy. Sheriff Morrison approached Jacob with the wary expression of a man caught between competing duties. "Thornton, I appreciate what you're trying to do here, but the council's decision wasn't just about money. This is about setting an example, making sure people understand the consequences of betraying community trust. And what example are we setting?" Jacob asked, his voice rising enough that those nearby could hear. "That we punish the innocent for the guilty. That we tie children to posts for their parents' sins. What kind of community does that make us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Jacob could see its impact on the faces around him. These were mostly good people who had let their anger and sense of betrayal push them toward a punishment that, in the clear light of alternative, looked increasingly harsh and misplaced. Mayor Caldwell, a heavyset man with a perpetually worried expression, pushed through the crowd toward Jacob. As the elected leader of Cedar Gulch, he bore the ultimate responsibility for maintaining both order and justice, a balance that had proven increasingly difficult in recent months. "Mr. Thornton, your offer is generous, but we can't simply allow debts to be erased by the kindness of strangers. What precedent does that set? What happens the next time someone decides to cheat our merchants and run off?" Jacob had anticipated this objection and had prepared his answer during the ride to town. "Then you pursue the one who committed the crime, not the family they left behind. And if someone else wants to step forward and pay their debts, that's between them and the creditors. The money gets paid either way, but the shame belongs to Patrick O'Sullivan, wherever he is, not to his daughter, who's done nothing but try to survive the mess he left behind." The debate continued for nearly an hour, with voices raising and tempers flaring as the community grappled with questions that cut to the heart of their values and identity. Throughout it all, Margaret remained bound to the post, listening to strangers argue over her fate, while the sun climbed higher and the heat became more oppressive. But something had changed in her demeanor. The resignation was gone, replaced by a flicker of hope and a growing amazement that someone she had never met was willing to fight for her freedom. Finally, Harold Jameson stepped forward, his face red with frustration and conflict. "All right, Thornton. If you're fool enough to pay good money for another man's debts, I won't stop you. Patrick O'Sullivan owed me $47.30. You pay that, and I'll consider his debt to me settled." One by one, the other merchants came forward with their claims. Samuel Rodriguez at the cantina, $18 for whiskey consumed but never paid for. Martha Stevens at the boarding house, $32 for rooms occupied during Patrick's brief periods of sobriety. The blacksmith, the feed store owner. Even the preacher came forward with small amounts that Patrick had borrowed for various emergencies and promises. When the tally was complete, the total came to $183.47, slightly less than Jacob had anticipated, but still a substantial sum. Without hesitation, he counted out the money from the leather pouch he carried, placing each payment directly into the hands of the creditor, while the entire town watched in fascination. "There," he said as the last debt was settled. "Every dollar accounted for, every debt paid. Now unto that girl and let her go home?" Sheriff Morrison looked to Mayor Caldwell, who nodded reluctantly. The legal and moral justification for Margaret's punishment had evaporated with Jacob's payments, leaving no grounds for continuing her humiliation. With hands that moved much more steadily than they had that morning, the sheriff cut the ropes that bound Margaret's wrists. She stumbled slightly as the bonds were released, her hands cramped from hours of being held in position. Jacob moved quickly to steady her, his touch gentle but sure. Up close, he could see the determination that had carried her through the ordeal, but also the exhaustion and fear that she had been hiding from the crowd. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked quietly. "I am now," she replied, her voice hoarse from the heat and stress. "Thanks to you, but I don't understand why you did this. You don't even know me." Jacob looked into her eyes, seeing intelligence and strength alongside the gratitude. Sometimes knowing someone isn't as important as knowing right from wrong. "You didn't deserve what was happening to you." The crowd began to disperse, some with satisfaction at seeing the debts paid, others with disappointment at being denied their spectacle. Margaret found herself standing in the town square beside a man who had just paid a small fortune for her freedom, unsure what was expected of her next or how she could ever repay such generosity. "I have to ask," she said hesitantly, "what you expect in return. I can't pay you back, at least not any time soon. I don't have anything of value to offer." Jacob studied her face, seeing the wariness that had been bred into her by years of living with a father whose promises meant nothing and whose debts always came due in unexpected ways. He realized that his rescue, however well-intentioned, had placed her in a different kind of bind, trading one form of obligation for another. "I don't expect anything in return," he said firmly. "The debt was your father's, not yours, and now it's paid. You're free to go wherever you want to go, do whatever you want to do. But I have nowhere to go," she admitted, the reality of her situation settling over her like a weight. "My father's gone. We lost our house months ago when he couldn't pay the rent, and everyone in town knows what happened today. I don't think anyone's going to be eager to give me work or shelter." Jacob hadn't considered this aspect of the situation, but as she spoke, he realized that his intervention, while solving one problem, had left others unaddressed. Margaret was still alone in the world, still carrying the burden of her father's reputation, still facing an uncertain future with few resources and fewer options. "There's always work at my ranch," he heard himself saying, the words emerging before he had fully thought them through. "Nothing fancy, just cooking and cleaning, tending the garden, that sort of thing. The pay isn't much, but there's a small cabin that goes with it, and you'd have your independence." Margaret stared at him in amazement. "You've already done more for me than anyone ever has. I can't let you give me a job out of pity." "It wouldn't be pity," Jacob replied honestly. "I really do need help around the place. Been living like a bachelor too long, eating beans out of cans and wearing the same shirt until it can stand up by itself. Having someone around who knows how to keep a proper household would be worth the wages, and that's the truth." She studied his face, looking for signs of deception or ulterior motives, but found only sincerity and a kindness that she had almost forgotten could exist in the world. The offer represented more than just employment. It offered her a chance to start over, to build a life separate from her father's failures and the town's judgment. "I accept," she said finally. "But I want to earn my keep fairly. I won't be a charity case, even from someone as generous as you've been today." "Fair enough," Jacob agreed, extending his hand to her. "Jacob Thornton." "Margaret O'Sullivan," she replied, shaking his hand with a firmness that surprised him. "And Mr. Thornton, thank you, not just for paying the debts, but for treating me like I had some say in my own future." The ride to Jacob's ranch took them through rolling hills covered in prairie grass that stretched toward distant mountains. Margaret sat beside him on the wagon seat, taking in the landscape with eyes that seemed to be seeing possibility where before there had only been limitation. They spoke little during the journey, both lost in thought about the dramatic changes the day had brought. Jacob's ranch sprawled across a natural valley, with a main house that was larger than Margaret had expected, several outbuildings, and corrals that held a small herd of horses. The cabin he had mentioned sat about 100 yards from the main house, close enough for convenience but far enough for privacy. It was small but well built, with a front porch that looked out over the valley and mountains beyond. "This is beautiful," Margaret said as they pulled up to the cabin. "I can't believe this is going to be my home." "For as long as you want it to be," Jacob replied, climbing down from the wagon and offering her his hand. "Carlos lives in the bunkhouse with a couple of the other hands, so you'll have neighbors if you need anything. And the main house is always open if you need to use the kitchen for anything more complicated than what the cabin allows." As Margaret explored her new home, Jacob found himself watching her reactions with an interest that surprised him. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten the pleasure of sharing a space with someone who appreciated its beauty and possibilities. Her delight in small details, the way the afternoon light fell through the windows, the view from the porch, the efficiency of the small kitchen, reminded him of aspects of his life that he had stopped noticing. "I'll start first thing tomorrow morning," Margaret said as they stood on the porch, watching the sun begin its descent toward the western mountains. "What time do you usually have breakfast?" "Dawn, usually. But don't worry about tomorrow morning. Take some time to settle in, get comfortable. This has been a difficult day for you." Margaret shook her head firmly. "Mr. Thornton, you've given me more kindness in one day than I've received in the past 3 years. The least I can do is start earning my wages right away. Besides, I think keeping busy will be good for me. Help me start thinking about the future instead of dwelling on the past." That evening, as Jacob sat on his own porch and listened to the sounds of Margaret moving around in the cabin, he reflected on the impulse that had driven him to town and the series of decisions that had led to this unexpected change in his solitary life. He had told himself that his actions were purely about justice, about helping someone who deserved better than the fate the town had chosen for her. But as he watched smoke curl from her chimney and saw the warm light in her windows, he realized that his motivations might have been more complex than he had admitted. For 8 years, he had convinced himself that he preferred solitude, that the complications of human relationships were more trouble than they were worth. His ranch had been his world, his cattle his primary companions, his books and his work his only sources of satisfaction. But Margaret's presence, even from a distance, reminded him of what he had been missing. Not romance necessarily, but simple human companionship. The pleasure of sharing daily experiences with someone who might understand and appreciate them. The next morning, Jacob woke to the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the main house. He found Margaret in his kitchen, preparing what looked like the most substantial breakfast he had seen in years. She moved with quiet efficiency, as if she had been working in this space for months rather than hours. "Good morning, Mr. Thornton. I hope you don't mind that I used your kitchen. The cabin stove is fine for simple things, but I thought you deserved a proper breakfast after everything you did yesterday." Jacob surveyed the spread she had prepared: eggs, bacon, biscuits that were golden brown and perfectly formed, coffee that actually had flavor instead of just caffeine. "This is incredible, Margaret. Where did you learn to cook like this?" "My mother taught me before she died, and I've had plenty of practice taking care of my father." Her expression darkened slightly at the mention of Patrick, but she continued steadily. "He might have been unreliable in most ways, but he always appreciated good food when I could manage to provide it." They ate in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the arrangements they were establishing. Jacob found himself studying Margaret's face in the morning light, noting the intelligence in her eyes and the resilience that showed in the set of her shoulders. She carried herself with the dignity of someone older than her 16 years, someone who had been forced to grow up too quickly, but had managed to do so without becoming bitter or hard. "Margaret," he said as they finished eating, "I want you to know that this arrangement can be whatever you need it to be. If you want to save money and move on to something else eventually, that's fine. If you decide you want to stay and make this your permanent home, that's fine too. I don't want you to feel trapped by gratitude or obligation." She considered his words carefully before responding. "Mr. Thornton, I appreciate that more than you know. But right now, I can't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. This is the first time in years that I've felt safe and valued. I'd like to see what I can make of that opportunity." The days that followed established a routine that brought more satisfaction to both of them than either had anticipated. Margaret threw herself into her work with an enthusiasm that transformed the ranch house from a functional bachelor space into something that felt like a real home. She planted a garden, organized the kitchen and pantry, mended clothes that Jacob had been meaning to repair for months, and gradually brought order and beauty to spaces that had been neglected. Jacob, for his part, found himself looking forward to the end of each day's work, knowing that he would return to a house that smelled of cooking food and felt warm with human presence. Their evening conversations, initially awkward and formal, gradually became more natural and wide-ranging. Margaret proved to be intelligent and well-read, with opinions on everything from politics to philosophy that challenged and engaged him. 3 weeks after her arrival, As they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, Margaret finally broached the subject that had been weighing on both their minds. "People in town are talking about us," she said quietly. "Carlos mentioned it when he went in for supplies yesterday. They're wondering about your motivations, about what kind of arrangement we really have here." Jacob had been expecting this conversation and had been dreading it in equal measure. Cedar Gulch was a small community where everyone's business was fair game for speculation, and the sight of a single man providing shelter for a young woman was bound to generate rumors and assumptions. "What kind of things are they saying?" "The usual things, I suppose. Some people think you're planning to marry me. Others assume I'm earning my keep in ways that have nothing to do with cooking and cleaning. A few seem to think you're just a lonely man who's been taken advantage of by a clever girl." "And what do you think?" Jacob asked, genuinely curious about her perspective on their situation. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. "I think you're a good man who saw someone in trouble and decided to help, even when it cost you money and reputation. I think you've given me a chance to discover who I can be when I'm not defined by my father's failures. And I think I'm grateful every day that you were brave enough to stand up for someone you barely knew. But..." Jacob sensed there was more she wanted to say. "But I also think we need to be realistic about what this looks like to other people. I'm 16 years old, unmarried, and living on your ranch. In a place like Cedar Gulch, that's going to generate talk no matter how innocent our arrangement really is." Jacob nodded, acknowledging the truth of what she was saying. He had been so focused on providing her with safety and opportunity that he had not fully considered the social implications of their situation. In a frontier community where reputation mattered enormously and social conventions were strictly enforced, their arrangement was bound to be viewed with suspicion. "So what do you think we should do?" he asked. "I don't know," Margaret admitted. "I don't want to leave. This is the first time in my life that I've felt like I have a real home and a chance for a future. But I also don't want to damage your reputation or make your life more complicated than it needs to be." That night, Jacob lay awake thinking about Margaret's words and the dilemma they faced. He realized that somewhere over the past 3 weeks, his feelings toward her had evolved beyond simple protectiveness or employer satisfaction. He had come to value her presence in his life in ways that went beyond her contribution to the household. Her intelligence, her strength, her quiet dignity, and her gratitude had all combined to make him care about her welfare in ways that were both deeper and more complex than he had initially acknowledged. But she was 16 years old, and he was 32. She was vulnerable and dependent on his generosity, and he was in a position of power over her situation. The ethical implications of any romantic feelings were troubling, regardless of how sincere they might be. And yet, he couldn't deny that when he imagined her leaving, when he considered the possibility of returning to the solitary life he had lived before, something in him rebelled against the prospect. The solution, when it came to him, was both simple and complicated. He would ask Margaret to marry him, not out of passion or romantic desperation, but as a practical arrangement that would provide her with security and social respectability while giving him the companionship he had come to cherish. It would be a marriage of mutual benefit and genuine affection, even if it was not the romantic love that songs and stories celebrated. The next evening, as they sat on the porch after dinner, Jacob broached the subject with the same directness he brought to all significant decisions. "Margaret, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about the talk in town and the complications our situation creates. I have a proposal that might address those concerns." She looked at him with curiosity and a touch of wariness, sensing that whatever he was about to say would be significant. "I'd like you to consider marrying me," he said simply, "not because of romance or passion, but as a practical arrangement that would give you legal protection and social respectability while allowing us to continue the partnership we've developed. I know it's not what most people dream of when they think about marriage, but it might be a solution that works for both of us." Margaret stared at him in silence for several minutes, her expression cycling through surprise, consideration, and something that might have been relief. "You're proposing a marriage of convenience. I suppose that's what it would be, though I hope it would be more than just convenient. I've come to care about you, Margaret, and I think you've brought something to my life that I didn't even realize I was missing. A marriage between us would be based on mutual respect and affection, even if it's not the passionate romance that young people usually hope for. And you're sure this is what you want? Not just a solution to a social problem, but something you genuinely think would make you happy. Jacob considered the question seriously before answering. I'm sure. These past 3 weeks have been the most content I've felt in years. Coming home to a house that feels alive, sharing meals with someone who actually listens when I talk, having someone to share the beauty of this place with, it's made me remember what I was missing in my solitary life. And if I agreed, what kind of marriage would it be? Would you expect, that is, would it be a real marriage in all ways? The question hung between them, both awkward and essential. Jacob had been wrestling with this aspect of his proposal, knowing that Margaret deserved honesty about his expectations, while also recognizing the delicacy of the subject. That would be entirely up to you, he said finally. I won't lie and say I haven't thought about it, but I would never pressure you or make you feel obligated in that way. If we married, it would be with the understanding that any physical aspect of our relationship would develop naturally, if at all, based on your comfort and desire. Margaret stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out over the valley that had become home to her. When she turned back to Jacob, her expression was serious but not troubled. I need some time to think about this. It's not a decision I can make quickly, even though I appreciate your honesty and the respect you're showing me by asking rather than assuming. Of course. Take all the time you need. Can I ask you something? Anything. If I were older, if we had met under different circumstances, do you think you might have come to love me in the romantic way? The question was so direct and vulnerable that it took Jacob's breath away. He looked at Margaret, really looked at her, seeing not just the girl he had rescued from public humiliation, but the young woman she was becoming. The intelligence and strength that defined her character, the beauty that was emerging as she grew into herself. I think I might already be heading in that direction, he admitted. But you're right that the circumstances complicate things. I want to be sure that any feelings between us develop freely, without the pressure of gratitude or dependence. Margaret nodded, seeming satisfied with his answer. I'll give you my answer tomorrow evening. That night, Margaret sat by her cabin window, looking toward the main house where Jacob's lamp still burned in his study. The proposal had not been entirely unexpected. She had sensed the growing affection between them, and had wondered how their situation might resolve itself. But having it stated so clearly, so honestly, forced her to examine her own feelings and desires in ways she had been avoiding. She was grateful to Jacob, certainly, but she had come to realize that her feelings extended beyond gratitude. She respected his integrity, appreciated his intelligence, and had grown fond of his quiet strength and unexpected gentleness. When she imagined leaving the ranch, the prospect felt like losing something precious that she had only just discovered. When she imagined staying as his wife, the idea brought a sense of rightness that surprised her with its strength. But she was 16 years old, and she knew that her experience with men was limited to her unreliable father and the respectful distance that Jacob had maintained. Was she mature enough to make a decision that would shape the rest of her life? Was it fair to Jacob to accept his proposal when she couldn't be entirely sure of her own motivations? On the other hand, what were her alternatives? She could leave the ranch and try to make her way in a world that had shown her little kindness before Jacob's intervention. She could remain as his housekeeper and face the continuing speculation and judgment of the community. Or she could accept his proposal and build a life based on mutual respect and growing affection, trusting that deeper love might develop over time. The next evening, as promised, she gave Jacob her answer. I'll marry you, she said as they stood together on the porch where they had shared so many conversations. Not just because it's practical, though it is, but because I think we have the foundation for something real and lasting. I care about you, Jacob, more than I realized until I faced the possibility of having to make a choice. Jacob felt something tight in his chest loosen at her words. Are you sure? I don't want you to feel pressured or rushed. I'm sure. But I have one condition. What's that? I want us to have a real engagement period, maybe 6 months, where we get to know each other even better and make sure this is right for both of us. If either of us has doubts during that time, we should be free to change our minds without hard feelings. Jacob extended his hand to her, and when she took it, he raised it to his lips in a gesture that was both formal and tender. I think that's very wise. Margaret O'Sullivan, Will you do me the honor of becoming engaged to marry me?" "Yes, Jacob Thornton, I will." The news of their engagement was received in Cedar Gulch with a mixture of surprise, speculation, and grudging approval. Some people continued to whisper about Jacob's motivations and Margaret's fortune in landing such a respectable husband. But the formal nature of their arrangement and the obvious respectability of their behavior gradually silenced most of the gossip. The 6 months that followed were a period of discovery and growth for both of them. They talked more openly about their hopes and fears, their past experiences and future plans. Margaret continued her education with books from Jacob's library, while he learned to appreciate her perspectives on literature and philosophy. They worked together on ranch projects, traveled to neighboring towns for supplies and social events, and gradually became known as a couple whose partnership was based on genuine compatibility and mutual respect. As Margaret approached her 17th birthday, both of them realized that what had begun as a practical arrangement had developed into something deeper and more meaningful. Their affection had grown into love, their respect had deepened into genuine admiration, and their partnership had become essential to both of their concepts of happiness.